All right, so this chapter is going to be over the brain, which the brain controls a lot of our functions that we have within our body. So we're going to talk about things such as motor control, reflexes, dementia, mental disorders. This is going to be a really interesting chapter, but it's also going to be a very long chapter. So let's go ahead and get into it. So within this picture here should kind of look familiar. So if you look closely, we have some different regions here. So we have our frontal lobe. If this goes back to the chapter of our regions and in our bones, we know that the front portion is the frontal, here's the parietal, the occipital, and the temporal. So those regions and those bones were named for a reason because these are also referred to as in the brain. Now, all these lobes can be separated by essentially what's called a sulcus, which are essentially a deep groove. So you have the central sulcus. So essentially where the coronal suture would be, this would be the sulcus. We have the lateral sulcus, which is going to separate the parietal and the frontal lobe from the temporal. And then you have the parietal occipital sulcus, which is going to separate the parietal lobes from the occipital lobes. Additionally, we have the cerebellum that's down here. That's going to be essentially at the inferior portion of our brain. And then we have the pons and the medulla oblongata, which is going to be the very one of the beginning portions of our spinal cords. So this is actually what our brain actually looks like if we were to take one actually out. So it looks very similar to the actual illustration. If we take a look underneath the brain, so here we can actually see how our eyes are going to essentially attach to our brain, or essentially going to innervate our brain. So we have our optic tracts. These right here are called the olfactory bulbs. So this is essentially the base of the nerves that's going to essentially be in our nose, which is going to allow us to be able to smell, to make or associate smells with certain different memories. These are the nerves that are going to essentially cause or stimulate smell. Here we have what's called the pituitary gland, which when we start talking about hormones, we'll actually understand a little bit more about this gland. But this gland here secretes a good portion of the hormones that we actually use day to day. The X portion of the optic tract, we call the optic chiasm. So this is the part where they actually meet and actually connect to each other. You have the diencephalon, which essentially is going to be the midbrain. And then you have the brain stem, which is going to be the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, which is going to essentially stem into the spinal cord. And then, of course, you have the cerebellum, which we just referred to earlier. So if we actually cut it in half, so this is actually what it would look like. So essentially our brain, you could divide it in half and it would be the exact same on each side. So the biggest portion here that we need to take a look at is this big ear-shaped structure here. This is referred to as the corpus callosum. This is what's going to allow for each hemisphere of your brain to actually connect to each other. So the two portions of your brain, the two hemispheres of your brain can actually be separated. They can actually work independently of each other. But essentially, the corpus callosum acts as a bridge between both sides of the brain. And you need that to understand what happens on one side of the body to the other side of the body. So essentially, each hemisphere of the brain actually controls one half of the body, and the other part controls the other half. So in order for them to actually communicate with each other, they have to have the corpus callosum, which essentially allows axons and neurons to actually go across from one side of the brain to the other. Then you have the pineal gland, which you can kind of see right here at the very base underneath the corpus callosum. So this gland is what's responsible for producing melatonin. That gland is what's going to essentially regulate your sleep cycles. This is essentially what it tells your brain that it's time to start winding down, to start going to sleep. Let's see here. We have the cerebellum, which we refer to as the inside structure as the tree of life. So if you look at it, it actually does kind of like a tree. So this particular region of your brain here is going to essentially work with fine motor movements. So allowing your hand to move smoothly, not tremble like this, or also to be able to walk nice and smoothly and without stumbling. And then again, here we can see what the pons in the middle looks like. You can always remember the pons because the pons looks like a backwards P, like a lowercase p backwards. That's that really prominent hump that's going to be in your at the base of your brain or the beginning of your spinal cord. And then the last portion of it's going to be the medulla oblongata, which that's going to really control like your heart rate, your respirations, and also vomiting. So if you have ever vomited, it's due to this region of the spinal cord right here. And then here is what it actually looks like if you were to actually take out a human brain. And it looks pretty similar. So here you have your thalamus, and then you have your pituitary gland that's going to be right here. But this one I think is actually missing. So traumatic brain injuries. So a contusion is simply is a fancy medical word for a bruise. So a bruise essentially when if you've ever gotten a bruise, it's usually due to some type of physical trauma. So if you get hit, essentially you have blood vessels in your tissues. Those blood vessels are going to essentially leak into your tissues, and you're actually that black and blue that you're seeing is dead blood cells, and also the dead tissue that has been essentially impacted. Over time, that bruise is going to start changing colors. It's going to go from black to blue to red to yellow. So what happens is your blood cells, when they begin to degrade or start breaking down, they start releasing their pigments. And essentially your red blood cells, of course, they've now died. That's why they turn black. But as they start deteriorating, they start essentially gradually breaking down, and they change colors. So it goes from essentially black, blue to red. That red is going to essentially change from red to yellow. So also understand that the reason why our stools and our urine is the color that they are is because of our red blood cells. You produce about 3 million red blood cells per second, and they only have a lifespan about 90 to 120 days. So they're only going to last for a certain amount of time, and your body has to get rid of them. So there's two ways your body gets rid of them. Either it's going to send it through your stools, which is that's why you get the brown color, or essentially it's going to essentially excrete it in your urine, which your urine is usually yellow typically. It should be either clear to pale yellow, but that's where the color comes from, is because it's a breakdown by red blood cells. So when it comes to bruising, that's what's actually happening. Essentially, the trauma has essentially burst a bunch of blood vessels, and those blood vessels have you're essentially having internal bleeding. And then also you've damaged that tissue, and now that tissue is trying to heal, but also is trying to get rid of those red blood cells that have essentially died in that tissue. Now, also, along with contusion, you have concussion. So, especially with football players or in sports that have high impact or high physical impact or touch sports, you're more likely prone to get a concussion. So, a concussion is essentially when the brain slaps up against the skull or some part of your skull, and essentially it's going to cause a bruise. That could potentially be bad because essentially your brain controls every single part of your body. So different regions of your brain control different parts of your body. So if you were to hit your frontal cortex, you're going to have a hard time thinking and being able to cognitive think and make decisions. So that's one reason why when we test for concussions, we usually do either the finger sign, or to see if our fingers make trails, to see if their eyes are moving properly, because different depends on what part of the brain has been affected. It gives different signs. So sometimes you have what's called a second impact syndrome, which essentially is when I was in athletic training, you'd have football players try to pretend that they didn't have a concussion, so they didn't get benched for the rest of the season. Well, if you got hit again, the repercussions of that concussion was actually worse because now you've already had a concussion, so you essentially bruised your brain and it's trying to heal. Now you do it again, and essentially it makes it 10 times worse, which can possibly lead to long-term cognitive defects, motor impairments. Um, Sometimes it leads to a lifetime full of mental issues or disorders because you essentially impacted it twice at this point, or even more. So anytime you have concussion, you hit your head, you should always go get checked out and make sure that you don't have a concussion or that your brain is actually okay. Because remember, your brain does not have any pain receptors. So you're not going to essentially feel that your brain is hurting. Same thing, reason why we put baseball helmets on baseball players, especially protect that temporal bone in their skull. That bone is really thin, and if you get hit there, you can cause internal bleeding within the brain, and then that can push on the brain because it can make essentially hematoma, and that's going to essentially cause a lot of pressure to be put on the brain. So anytime there is a head concussion or a head injury, you always should get it checked out. So we can have what's called a neural tube defects. So essentially, when during development, some things can go wrong, some things may not essentially code correctly, or deformities can occur. Um, so essentially, there are a few things that can occur. And remember, during development, it's a very crucial time because there's so many cells that are dividing and reproducing. You can end up with something called spina bifida. So spina bifida is essentially where the mother doesn't take vitamins, or the mother is lacking in vitamins, more specifically in B9 and B12, I believe. So if we take a look here, we can actually see this is essentially a transverse cut of the child's back. And so here we can see the vertebral body of the vertebrae. If we go back to the bone chapter, if you look even closely or closer, you don't see the transverse processes and the spinous processes because there aren't any. So the only thing here, there's nothing to protect the spinal cord or the tube that runs along the spinal cord to circulate the fluid. So that fluid that's circulating around the spinal cord now has essentially, there's only a thin membrane between that and the skin. So it's very easy to pop. It's just like almost like a zit, essentially. It's a very thin layer between the skin and the spinal cord. That's a bad thing because if you get an infection in here, it gets into your spinal cord, it goes up your spinal cord, gets into your brain, and your brain controls everything. So essentially, you can essentially cause a lot of damage or even death by having spina bifida. So this is actually what it would look like on a child. So now you can see that this has ruptured, is exposed to the outside world, which means it is very prone to get an infection. Typically, children that have this do not live for a long period of time unless they get it corrected. But again, if they get infected, it gets to their brain, it gets to the rest of their body. So there's two different types of spina bifida. There's spina bifida cystica and there's spina bifida occulta. So this one here, you can kind of see that we have a little bit of, or a little bit more protection, but not enough. This one has a higher survival rate because it does have some protection around the spinal cord, but not really enough. Typically, a telltale sign that a person is dealing with this, or a child that has this, is because in their lower back and their lumbar region, they'll have like a little patch of hair right there above the portion where spina bifida is occurring. So this one we have a little more protection, but this one we don't have any, and so essentially you can pop this. This essentially is a big bump, and you can pop it, and it ends up like this. This happens because the intake of B12 and B9, the mother hasn't taken it. So this is one reason why it's very important to take prenatal vitamins. If you don't take them, especially if you're lacking in vitamins, you can potentially cause a lot of harm to the child. Also, this is referred to as folic acid. So if you look on the back of soda cans or any essentially beverages that you drink, um, there is actually B9 and B12 in some of our soft drinks. Now, does that mean you should drink soda every day while you're pregnant? No. But remember, everything we eat has vitamins, minerals, ions, carbohydrates, proteins. So everything that we eat, hopefully it's in our diet that we're getting what we need. However, sometimes we're deficient in some things. So that's one reason why they might put you on prenatal vitamins. So the meninges, so you may have heard of something called meningitis. So meningitis, if you take those words apart, so the first part or the prefix would be meninges, and then that last part would be itis. So itis always means inflammation. So literally, this be inflammation of the meninges. So the meninges are actually composed of three layers of the dura mater. So you have the dura mater, which is composed of the meningeal layer, which is going to have your arachnoid space, your pia mater, and your dura mater. So in the dissection video, I actually show you that very outer layer actually is meninges. In this arachnoid space, it's called arachnoid because it mimics a spider web. So, like if you have a fear of spiders, it's called arachnophobia. Or if you have, or in Spanish, spiders araña. So that's where it comes from. It looks like a spider web. If you notice here in the subarachnoid space, you have blood vessels, but you do not see it anywhere else in the brain. This is your blood-brain barrier. So you in your brain, you have a barrier that separates where any other blood can actually enter. Now, we've talked about in previously that all cells need to have glucose, ions, and oxygen. And how all cells get that is by essentially sending it through the cardiovascular system. However, in the brain, those tissues, these neurons in our brain are very highly sensitive. So remember, our blood also carries other things and toxins and potentially acids and bases. So it has to be very selective of what actually crosses that blood-brain barrier. There's only certain chemicals that can get across that barrier, and that's for a reason. It's so that it can protect this sensitive neurons. Those remember this our brain controls all of our body. It's the central nervous system. It's called that for a reason. So if that is to get affected or to get harmed, it can cause havoc across the rest of the body. Here we also have what's called white matter. So if you see something called white matter, that means that there is a axon that has myelin sheath around it. Remember, myelin sheath are those little bitty, those things that are covering the axon, going down the axon to help those potentials move a lot quicker. So the pia mater, which is like the innermost layer, which is a very thin layer made of areolar connective tissue. So this takes us back to the tissue chapter. So essentially, anytime we have areolar tissue, it's going to adhere the skin, essentially the surface layer, to the central tissue that is going to be the main composing tissue. So, like in the chicken dissection video, we had the skin, and then the skin between the skin, we had areolar tissue or connective tissue that was going to connect it to the skeletal muscle. So essentially, it's a connective tissue. It helps connect the meninges to the actual brain. So with meningitis, a telltale sign of meningitis is going to be if someone has severe neck pain. This isn't like if you sleep on your neck wrong. This is like a severe throbbing, hurting, heated pain that's going to be right around your neck. So meningitis can either be bacterial or it can be a viral infection. Hopefully it's bacterial because bacterial is something that we can treat. We can try to treat viral, but it's better to treat bacterial. They're usually, if you come to college, they usually make students take a meningitis shot because you can get this in close proximities to other people. So if you're in the army or if you're in close proximity to a lot of other people, usually like in colleges where you have to live in dorms, they're going to enforce you to take a meningitis shot because it's highly likely that you could potentially catch it. You can also end up with encephalitis, which essentially is acute inflammatory disease of the brain. So you have to remember your brain is encased in your skull, and there's very minimal space for that to happen. If you're having swelling, that means your brain goes from this to this, and there's only so much space in your brain. If it swells up, it can push on different portions of your brain and cause neurons to fire when they're not supposed to, or make them not fire at all. So remember, your brain controls everything, so everything has to work perfectly. If something is pushing on your brain or your brain is being pushed, it can shut down parts of your body. It can make parts of your body happen quicker or faster. It can potentially cause seizures. It can potentially cause memory loss, or even for you to potentially even die. So it's very important that if we do have some type of infection, we're able to treat it very quickly. This is one reason why they'll do a spinal tap. So essentially, they go into your lumbar region and they actually kind of they tap in a needle, and then they drain off the cerebral spinal fluid that's circulating around your brain. And they're looking to see if it's a different color. So just like your snot, if you blow your nose and it's green or yellow, that's a sign, a big sign that there's an infection, there's bacteria or some type of virus. So that's how we are able to determine if there's some type of bacterial infection on the brain, or the brain is having some type of inflammation. So if we look even closely, so this is an actual cadaver. And here we can see that we have what's called the falx cerebri, which is a very thin layer or membrane that helps separate the lobes. Now, if you remember saying at the very beginning that the corpus callosum, which is going to be right in the space here, is what's going to connect. It's going to be the bridge between the both hemispheres. So you have to have compartmentalization. So essentially, this falx cerebri is going to essentially separate the left side from the right side of the brain. And then here we can see we have the sinuses, which is going to drain blood away from the brain, from the blood-brain barrier. So you can have what's called a hematoma, which hema means blood, toma means tumor. So essentially, you can have if you have bleeding on the brain, remember when blood bleeds out, it's going to clot or make a really big coagulation, which can essentially cause a big bulge on the brain. So essentially, if you have bleed on the brain, you can essentially have this big bolus of blood or pocket of blood that's going to essentially harden. And now it's going to start pushing on different parts of your brain, depends on where you have a brain bleed. That can potentially cause death. That can also cause seizures. If they can't stop the bleeding, then you'll essentially bleed all across your brain. Your blood has a lot of toxins in it, so it can be neurotoxic and can start killing your brain cells. So it's very, very crucial that we get to it in time. You can have an epidural hematoma or a subdural hematoma, which literally just subdural means below the dura mater. That's where that name comes from. Hopefully, if you ever do have one, or know someone that has one, hopefully they can get treated very quickly. So it's very time sensitive. If you're not able to essentially remove that blood, it can cause a lot more issues as time progresses. So in your brain, you actually have ventricles. This is what you're seeing here. So you have four. So you have two lateral ventricles because you have one in each side of the hemispheres. Then you have a third ventricle, which is in the middle between the twos, and then a fourth that's going to be another reservoir that right before it goes down the spinal cord. So your brain actually sits or floats in fluid, in cerebral spinal fluid. So cerebral spinal fluid is really just the plasma portion of your blood. It's the water portion with your ions, your glucose, and your other electrolytes and oxygen. So fluid is going to flow through all of these ventricles. Essentially, they're kind of like reservoirs that are going to essentially wash and flush the brain with continuous cerebral spinal fluid. Also, your cerebral spinal fluid acts as a cushion. So let's say you fall, to protect your brain from slapping up against the side of your skull, there's fluid that is right around the entire brain. So essentially it acts as a cushion, kind of like a waterbed kind of thing. It kind of acts as a cushion. It can only act as a cushion for so much force, but it does act as a temporary cushion so that it can protect the brain. That's the only protection the brain has besides the skull and the cerebral spinal fluid. That is the only protection that it has. So here you can actually see, looking in both the anterior and lateral views of how these ventricles are, they're all connected to each other. So they flow through here to make sure that the brain has its proper nutrients, that it also gets rid of waste. Also, in here, we have what's called a choroid plexus, which is going to create our spinal fluid. And here's what the choroid plexus looks like. You see all these little cells within the pia mater. These are going to essentially what's going to create your spinal fluid, and they're going to do it morally from plasma of your bloodstream. That's one reason why you see a capillary running through here, is because it's going to essentially secrete the water out of the blood and leave the red blood cells, white blood cells, and other toxins, and they'll keep flowing on, but they kind of separate the water out of it. And so here you can actually see it goes from one, so the lateral ventricles is going to circulate around the blood or around the brain. So this one does a really good job of showing how it actually flows. So it goes from the lateral ventricles down to the third ventricles, and then it goes around the brain, and then it comes down the spinal cord. So all the way around your brain and down the spinal cord, there is cerebral spinal fluid. And this is the purpose of that. It is to protect it, and also to flush it, make sure there's no toxins around these neurons, because your neurons are very, very sensitive to chemicals. So here's a type of disorder, which is called hydrocephalus. Hydro meaning water, and cephalo is meaning head. So essentially, if the cerebral spinal fluid does not drain properly, if there's a blockage in the brain where the cerebral spinal fluid, you can essentially have a backup of fluid all around the brain. And essentially, in fetuses, we know that their skull is not hard yet; it's still flexible. It's more like cartilage than anything. So essentially, remember, those sutures aren't sutures; they're kind of like this. They're not sutures yet. So essentially, water can essentially back up into the brain or into the skull and essentially make it essentially expand. And that's what you're seeing with this child here, is that their head is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. This can be corrected if they have to essentially put in what's called a drain or a shunt. Essentially, they are going to put in the perineal portion, so essentially around the bladder, around the pubic area. This is where they're going to allow it to drain. So essentially, they have to insert a tube that's going to essentially allow the cerebral spinal fluid to drain. So if they can fix this, that child can essentially survive. If they don't, that water will push too much pressure on the brain. So either the brain won't develop properly, or essentially the child will end up having a lot more disorders, potentially seizures, and then eventually in death. So again, here it refers to the blood-brain barrier. And we have what's called astrocytes. Astrocytes come from cyte meaning cells, and astro meaning star. So this is star-like cells, ergo the name astros. And so these are going to essentially wrap around the blood vessels, and these are going to essentially allow things to come into the cell, out of the cell. Is also going to make sure that nothing is potentially going to harm the tissues around it. It also facilitates a lot more materials to pass within the brain that need to be there, and then things that don't need to be there. So essentially, our blood vessels, if you remember, your blood vessels are made out of simple cells. This is why you see these lines and these nucleuses in the blood cells that make up the blood vessel. They can become leaky or permeable. Essentially, these crevices or these lines essentially can start separating, then kind of open up a little bit, which allows for more leakage to happen. It's the same thing that happens when your nose is watering or running, at least. And so here you can actually see what's happening within the blood cells. So here we can see that or the blood vessels, we can see that we have glucose flowing out of the blood vessels. We also have other lipid substances and ions. However, the red blood cells are going to stay within the bloodstream. They do not get out, they just keep passing through. So the only thing that gets to really pass through is glucose, water, ions, and lipids. And that's really important, especially when it comes to other substances, because there are some substances that can pass through the blood-brain barrier, such as alcohols, certain medicines. Some of these things can actually slip past that blood-brain barrier. So the cerebrum is essentially the location of consciousness and thought processes. So remember, our cerebrum is the big portion, the big lobes of our brain. So this essentially is for cognition. It's also the center of intelligence, reasoning, thought, memory, judgment, voluntary control of skeletal muscle movement. So the cerebrum has a really big role to play in a lot of the functions that we have. Also, it has a big thing to deal with our vision, hearing, touch, smell, taste. Proprioception, which essentially is the brain recognizing if we're standing up, sitting down, if we're laying down, laying on our side, kind of thing. So gray matter. So we know white matter is where we have a bunch of axons that have myelin on them. Gray matter does not have any myelin on them, but they are still important. Gray matter essentially functions as integration and processing. So when we're thinking about things, we need gray matter. Again, the corpus callosum is white matter, so it has a bunch of axons which help connect, which is the bridge between the left and the right hemispheres. And here we can actually see the frontal lobes, the parietals, and the occipital lobes. And all of these grooves are called sulcus or sulci. That's the actual name for those. And then the ridges or the bumps are going to be called the gyrus. So if we take a look here, we can actually see the functional areas of the brain. So the front lobe is essentially for primary motor cortex. So remember, motor means movement. Also, the frontal eyelid field, or the frontal eye field. So essentially, the way our eyes are essentially interpreting things. So this essentially, so not only does it happen in the occipital lobe, but it also happens in the frontal lobe as well, for us to essentially understand what's happening. We have the insula, which essentially is the primary gustatory cortex. So the gustatory just means that this is where we're going to have the thought process on how we're hungry, if we're hungry or not. This is what that's going to be. Then you have what's called Wernicke's area. Wernicke area is where essentially you're able to understand words or written language. So think about Wernicke with written. This is how you're able to understand writing and text. You also have another area in this region here called the Broca's area, which is where essentially you're able to speak words. So if a person has a stroke and is unable to read, we know that they're being affected in the Wernicke's area. If they are unable to speak, we know that Broca's area in this region here has been affected. The temporal lobe is for auditory and auditory association. So essentially, remember your ears right there. So essentially, this is the portion where your mind is able to interpret what you're hearing and able to make sense of it. Your parietal lobes are for primary somatosensory cortex. So essentially, your senses. This is essentially where all those get interpreted. So the central sulcus is literally that line that divides the front portion of the brain from the back portion, versus the lateral is the deep groove that separates the parietals from the temporal. You can't actually see this. There's just deeper grooves that just separate the lobes. Remember, the lobes aren't just this scrunchy looking deal. This is a bunch of cells of neurons and sheets of neurons that are folded. Remember, with folding, we essentially the more folding something has, the more surface area that it has. So the more folding that your brain has, the more essentially the more space or more tissue that you have, the more neurons that you have, the more connections that you can make. If you want to insult someone, some people call people smooth-brained individuals. If you have a smooth brain, that means you don't have a lot of surface area. You don't have a lot of neurons, which means you're not that very bright. So that's an insult that some people call each other, and they don't realize it's an insult, but that's the reason why it's an insult. The more folding you have, the better off your brain is, or how better your brain works. If you don't have much folding or grooves or ridges in your brain, it doesn't work that well. So the temporal lobe is for involved with hearing and smell. And then the occipital lobe, which is at the very back of your head or your brain, essentially for processing visual information or storing strong memories or strong visual memories, at least. Um, the hippocampus is also usually involved in memory as well. So here we have this funky looking picture here, but it's called the homunculus. So this is a representation of if we took off the primary somatosensory cortex. This is just showing us how or what portions of the brain actually are controlling what portions of the body. So here they have it highlighted. So this is the primary motor cortex of the brain. And here it actually breaks it down into what portions of the body are being affected. So if you notice here that the face has a good portion of the brain as well as the hand. If you think about it, our hands have a lot more sensory. Also, it has to have a whole lot more muscle tunement. So remember, this is the primary motor cortex. So remember, motor means movement. So our hands have to have very, very fine movements, just like our face. Our face has a lot of muscles in it. So it takes a lot of precision to make sure those muscles work properly and that they're finely tuned. Our trunk or our stomach area or abdominal area, we don't really have to fine tune movements very much. I mean, we just really use that for breathing more per se. But this, our hands are able to do a lot of different things. They're able to do a lot of different motions. So it requires a much bigger portion of our primary cortex. Same thing with the primary somatosensory cortex. Our hands, our lips, our face, they take up a good portion of that as well. So each region of the brain controls different things of our body. So it's not the whole thing. It's every portion or section of the brain has a different function and role. So autism, which is a disorder, and there's a lot of taboo things around autism. Um, we have to agree on this for sure. Um, People who have autism are still humans. They're still human beings. They still have human rights. They should still deserve to be treated just like any other individual. They should not be made fun of. Um, they should be treated just as equal. They're no different. With autism, their brains are just wired a little bit differently. And actually, everyone's mind is actually kind of wired differently. So essentially, autism, so individuals with autism essentially are highly sensitive to stimuli, such as loud noises and unfamiliar people. So sometimes they also have issues adjusting to new people or new routines. So if you remember things like sight, especially like when you have a migraine, your light, hearing things can essentially aggravate you. So same thing with autism. Those are neurons that transfer that information to the brain. Essentially the brain has a difficulty processing that information. So with loud noises, the temporal region of the brain has a hard time processing information. Um, Especially loud noises, lights, can essentially cause different portions of the brain to not act correctly. Um, People who have autism, depends on what part of the spectrum that they're on, depends because it's a really broad spectrum. There's Asperger's, um, there's all different types of there's different levels of autism. But sometimes people can have meltdowns. Actually, when I was younger, there was a kid my age that was essentially suffering autism. I didn't know until I got older, but he would always have a lot of tantrums and meltdowns. And this isn't just like, a child not getting candy. This was like meltdowns of like, hitting his head, jumping up and down, stomping, just randomly. Sometimes even it mentions here that you can have flapping, rocking, resistance to change of routine. Typically, they kind of want to do the exact same thing. They have a routine. They wear the same clothes, kind of thing. They don't like to change things at all. Um, and it actually typically affects more males than it does females. So it actually affects 4 times more um, males than females, and usually it can run in siblings. So if your sibling has it, there's a potential that you can have it as well. Um, However, autism does not come from vaccines. That is a big myth. Apparently, in 1988, there was a false claim that was made by a doctor that was linked to the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. Um, that has been debunked. He actually lost his license for that statement. So there is no evidence to suggest that autism comes from vaccines. That is completely false. If anyone ever says that, they're completely false. There is no evidence to actually support that. Um, and vaccines do not work like that. It does not affect the brain. So that's one reason. One reason it's good to understand how the brain works is because vaccines do not actually affect the brain, especially that vaccine there. So Wernicke's area again, which this is just a book reiterating it, that Wernicke's area essentially is involved in recognizing, understanding, comprehending spoken or written language. And then Broca's area is essentially being able to speak the language. So one cool, interesting thing, if you are right-handed or left-handed, if we were to take your brain out, we could tell if you're right-handed or left-handed. So if you take a closer look here, if you are right-handed, the right portion of your brain will actually be just a slightly bigger than the left portion. And if you're left-handed, the left portion of your brain will be slightly bigger than the right portion, which is kind of cool that you can tell which side is more dominant. Now, what's called lateralization or cerebral lateralization, the brain has different regions. So the left side is not a necessarily mirror of the right side. Each lobe of the brain, they do have some overlapping functions, but there are some different areas. So Wernicke's and Broca's area is in your left hemisphere. You don't have that in your right hemisphere. The filling of shapes with the left hand is actually controlled by the right portion of the brain. So you have to understand that the right portion of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left portion of the brain controls the right side of the body. They're kind of crisscrossed. So what actually happens is if you have a stroke or something back caliper, if the left side of your brain is affected, the right side of your body is affected, and vice versa. If you have to remove half of your brain, so you can actually survive with only one half of your brain. If if let's say your left part of your brain is removed or dislocated or separated or cut in half, the right side of your brain can essentially take over and adapt and take over the responsibilities of the left side of the brain. It's really cool how our bodies can work and how it can essentially, if you lost something, it can essentially make something better. So just like when you lose sight, your other senses become heightened because now they have to essentially work to have it harder for your survival. Same thing here. If you were to split the corpus callosum in half, which sometimes it has to happen when people have a lot of seizures, sometimes we have to do surgery and actually separate the two lobes from each other so that they don't communicate with each other. And then sometimes the right side of the brain will essentially have to take over for the left side of the brain, because remember, speech and recognition of language is only on one side of the brain. So essentially, the right side of the brain will develop these structures or these regions to compensate for that. It's really cool of how our bodies can actually work. Epilepsy. So epilepsy is like you have a bunch of flashing lights. It stimulates those receptors, those light receptors in your eye, and it excites them so much that your brain gets overloaded and it can cause a seizure. So that's why one reason in some movies they'll actually say they'll give a warning at the very beginning that um, there's a series of repetitive lights that will be given off that could potentially cause seizures. So people who are prone to having seizures because of um, sudden blasts of light, they have to either shield their eyes or they have to essentially step away or not be in that vicinity because it can potentially cause a seizure to happen. Um, if this becomes a big issue, sometimes we have to do surgical removal of the brain or essentially take off a hemisphere of the brain or separate the brain. And so, just like I was saying earlier, sometimes we have to do this for people who have seizures. A cerebrovascular accident, which is it's a medical terminology for stroke. So essentially, with a stroke, there is a blood clot or some type of impediment that prevents the brain from getting its blood supply and its nutrients. So if you put someone in a chokehold for at least at minimum of 10 seconds, usually, you decrease the blood pressure to the brain. The brain requires a certain blood pressure. It has to maintain a constant blood pressure. If that is disrupted, you can cause syncope or loss of consciousness. So this is how why you see in movies when they are like putting someone in a chokehold, that's what they're doing. They're essentially they're increasing the blood pressure to the brain. The brain essentially reacts and essentially makes the whole body collapse because it loses its pressure, it loses its blood flow, it loses its ability essentially to control the body. So a CVA or a cerebral vascular accident, some type of blood vessel is blocking the brain, and so it's not able to get what it needs. And so essentially, if cells are unable to get the right amount of oxygen, the right amount of glucose, the right amount of ions, those cells start to die. And those cells, remember, your brain depends on what part of the brain, it controls different parts of your body. So if you have it in your temporal region, you might start having issues hearing, you might have issues smelling, you might have issues speaking if it's in the left hemisphere of your brain with Broca's or Wernicke's area. So different portions of your brain, if it starts becoming affected, it starts manifesting in physical symptoms. Now, with strokes, how we know what side of the brain's been affected. So if you have drooping in the right side of your face or in the right side of your body, we know that it's the opposite side in the brain. So remember, your left side of your brain controls the right side of your body and vice versa. So if you have drooping in the right side of your face or in the right side of your body, you're having a stroke in the left side of your brain. If you have drooping in your left portion of your face or the left portion of your body, we know that the right portion of your brain is now having a stroke. So we can kind of determine what side of the brain is having the cerebral vascular accident. Now you can have what's called a mini stroke, which is just it's a sudden stroke, but it passes very quickly, which is called a transient ischemic attack. Ischemia is the word for lack of oxygen or cells that are lacking oxygen. So just like in a myocardial infarction or an ischemic attack, essentially is where cells begin to die because there is a lack of oxygen. So these are the two different types of strokes that we usually do. Now, to get rid of a stroke, Typically, we're going to give a high blood thinner, especially if it's a CVA. We're going to give a very strong blood thinner that's going to break up that blood clot. We have to test to make sure there is a blood clot first, but we can give a very strong blood thinner. Usually, it's called TPA, and we can give a very strong blood thinner that's going to essentially break that apart and hopefully allow for that blood supply to return. So headaches, migraines. So there's actually a difference between the two. With headaches, essentially, it's tissues or blood vessels that become dilated on the side of the skull, which is going to essentially cause more blood pressure or blood supply, more pressure, which pushes on tissues, which is going to cause those receptors, those pain receptors, to be stretched, which sends signals to your brain to say, hey, you're having pain. So there's different types of headaches. There's a tension headache. There's a sinus headache. There's different types of headaches. So remember, your sinuses can put pressures on tissues. You can have a tension headache. If you stare at the computer screen for too long, like I've been doing, that can lead to a headache. If your glasses are too tight across your face, that can cause a headache. So it's tissues and blood vessels that have become dilated or essentially irritated that's causing your headache. Migraines, on the other hand, migraines are usually severe reoccurring headaches that are often usually on one side or another of the brain. So headaches aren't a brain disorder. However, they can feel like one. Migraines are essentially a baby seizure. People who have chronic migraines, either you can get Botox to help, or you can get like the piercing that goes in your ear. I think it's called the date piercing. Also, you can take what's called a Excedrin migraine, which essentially Excedrin is just really caffeine more than anything. So if you're having a migraine, usually it's really good to either drink coffee, Mountain Dew, something that has a lot of caffeine, because you have to understand with migraines, or even migraines and seizures, those neurons are firing really quickly. So in order to get them to kind of slow down, we give them something that makes them go even faster. And that sounds counterintuitive, but if you give someone an upper that is in a high stage or high energy stage to bring them down, we give them something that excites those electrons, which brings it down. I know that sounds backwards. If they're hyper, we're going to give them something that makes them more hyper, which brings them down. So same thing with migraines or seizures. We're going to give them something, if their neurons are firing really quickly, we're going to give them something that stimulates those neurons, which stimulating them brings them both down. It's kind of crazy how that works. It's like ADHD medicine. So people who have ADHD medicine, it brings them back down, right? Because it gives them something faster. But if I took ADHD medicine and I don't have ADHD, it brings me up. So it works in the reverse. So if I'm a natural downer and you give me an upper, it's going to make me hyper. If I'm a natural hyper and you give me an upper, it brings me down. It works vice versa. So same thing with migraines and seizures. That's how we treat them. So the same medicines that we prescribe for if you have chronic migraines, the same medicine that we would prescribe for seizures, we actually prescribe for migraines as well. Cerebral palsy, which is usually found in infants, it's a neuromuscular disorder that causes damage to infants' brains. So remember, as you're an infant, you are going through a lot of mitosis, and your brain is constantly developing until your skull fuses. If you have issues with this, if there's something potentially causing it not to happen, essentially you're going to have a lot of birth defects, disorders, and potentially death at that point. You can have also what's called Huntington disease, which is hereditary. It kind of almost looks like Parkinson's because there's a lot of rapid, jerky, involuntary movements. However, but this one is hereditary. And so this can also cause progressive intellectual deterioration. So essentially, you're unable to really think properly. Also, it changes your personality. You can have memory loss and irritability, and this usually happens in the mid 30s to 40s. And usually, after you contract this, within 10 years, you're usually kind of dead. Parkinson's disease is a slow progressing neurological disease. You tend to hear a lot more people suffering from this. Um, Essentially, you have plaques that build up in your brain cells. And this is one reason why it's so important that you get enough sleep. While you're sleeping, your brain essentially is cleaning up the mess that your brain has made that day. If you do not get enough sleep, it does not have enough time to clean those messes. And those messes can cause, or those plaques, just like on your teeth, those plaques can essentially cause neurological disorders. It can cause those neurons to essentially die. It can cause those neurons not to be able to make connections properly. So over time, um, it can cause a lot of degeneration. It also stops dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter, from being released from other cells to other cells. Um, so as symptoms develop, usually the person has loss of 80 to 90% of the cells responsible for producing dopamine. Um, there is no cure for it. There are medicines that help mitigate the symptoms or help make it mild, or kind of like mild the symptoms a little bit, but there isn't a fix for it just yet. We're still looking into it. So these two here, which these two people are very famous. So Muhammad Ali was a boxer, which the thing is, in boxing, it's a high contact sport. So it means that he was constantly getting hit over and over again. This actually led to his Parkinson's, essentially causing trauma to the brain over and over again, was causing a lot of issues. And Michael J. Fox, which he was a famous actor, if you ever watched the movie Back to the Future in 1985 or from 1985, he was a really big actor at that time too, but his was a little bit more, his wasn't really from trauma, his was essentially hereditary, versus Muhammad Ali's. So the pineal gland, which is responsible for making the melatonin. So pineal gland is right here on the very back underneath the corpus callosum. So this one is for making melatonin. So this is what's going to operate your sleep cycles. This is what's going to tell your body that it's kind of ready. It's time to start, or your brain to start winding down and getting ready for bed. Now, however, and this is kind of controversial, medicines or melatonin that, like in gummy melatonins or pill melatonins, those don't really have any validity. So here in the book, it says some companies are marketing the cell of melatonin in a pill form to cure jet lag, insomnia. However, this is yet to be proven. Um, so I know some people use melatonin gummies. Some people give it to their kids if they're staying up and being obnoxious. Um, there isn't any evidence to really support that just yet, but I mean, I think it works, but there's no evidence to really support that producing more melatonin causes you to be able to go to sleep, or it helps insomnia. Now, there are other sleep aids, such as like Benadryl. Benadryl is a big sleep aid, but melatonin is just a hormone that kind of tell your brain it's time to start winding down. But there's other factors that actually come into play when it comes to making you um, go to sleep. So like that's one reason why you have to have your cool room. Your feet had to be kind of warm. Your blood pressure has to essentially lower. There's a lot of other factors that have to come into play to keep you to go to sleep. Also, if you have an insomnia, that means that you're having a lot of brain activity, which means your neurons are still firing a lot quicker than they're supposed to be. So there's other things that happen than just melatonin. The thalamus, which is this region here in your brain, the thalamus is a really big portion of our brain because even though it's a small portion, it has a really big duty. So essentially, it's the relay point for sensory information. So all your senses, your sight, smell, touch, taste, that all runs through the thalamus, this little region here in your brain. Essentially, it's a relay station for the rest of your brain. So essentially, it tells this portion is going to tell different parts of your brain what is happening. Then this is going to kind of send messages to the rest of your brain to tell your body what to do. So the thalamus has a really, really big duty when it comes to relaying sensory information. So the thalamus is also responsible for filtering out sound sights in a crowded cafeteria room. So like if you're playing music for a long period of time, if you notice, you'll actually tune it out. It's because, and this is really because of your thalamus. Also, it's because your mind recognizes that it's not a threat, so it just tunes it out. That's one reason why if you're ever driving, you have to turn the radio down so that you can see better. Is because there's so much input coming into your brain. It only has so much room to try to interpret. So all that input from music takes away from you to be able to focus and concentrate and read and have your cognitive thought processes going. So that's one reason why you have to turn the music down when you're trying to look at something. So essentially, the thalamus has a really big role to play when it comes to any senses that we have. It's literally telling the brain what's going on. The hypothalamus, which is right here, it's this region right here, which has a really big role to play when it comes to hormones, which when we get into the hormone chapter, we will see it has a big, big role to play. Here, the infundibulum, which is the little tiny stalk that goes down to the pituitary. The pituitary gland stores a lot of our hormones, like oxytocin, which is our love hormone. You have ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone. Growth hormones are hormones that control our adrenaline rush. All those hormones are either stored or they're produced by the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So those have a really big role to play in some of our bodily functions. The medulla, or the hypothalamus, excuse me, it has a lot to do with your food intake, your water intake, regulating your circadian rhythm, which is your sleep and wake cycles. Also, it's the part of the limbic system that's going to control responses to pleasure, aggression, fear, contentment, and sex drive. So this region of your brain controls a lot of different body processes. So if it depends on what part of your brain is damaged or there's trauma affecting it, can affect different portions of your body. So this is one reason why we have to study the different parts of the brain, because different parts of the brain control different parts of the body. So here is actually a deeper version of the brainstem. So here we have where it's coming up from the spinal cord from the rest of the body. We have your pons and then your medulla. This is coming up. This is the base of or the very top of your spinal cord. Now, and this is what it looks like to the side. So if you notice here, it's called the dicephalon because there's two portions. So this is the thalamus. And here's your pineal gland, which is going to produce your melatonin. So this is all right behind each other. This is all on the midbrain, or the essentially the beginning portion of your spinal cord. Now, on your spinal cord, especially in the medulla, you have the cardiovascular center and the respiratory center. So your medulla has a big influence on your heart rate, and also on your respiratory rate. So during pregnancy, either it's hormones or by the baby being pushing up on against the spinal cord when they're laying in the stomach or in the womb, it actually can either send hormones to tickle the medulla and the pons, which is going to essentially cause the mother to have essentially a high heart rate. That can be an issue sometimes, just because during pregnancy you don't want preeclampsia, which preeclampsia just means high blood pressure. So if you have high blood pressure during pregnancy, it can essentially cause blood vessels to rupture. It can cause the child's blood vessels to rupture during development. It can cause a lot of different issues to happen. So that's one reason why we have to maintain that. But that's also one sometimes why when the mother's laying down, those hormones can tickle the medulla or the pons and essentially cause your respiratory rate to kind of like either decrease or increase, or you start kind of like almost like hyperventilating, is because it's essentially affecting the the medulla essentially. It's causing that medulla to send or make the heart pump faster, and it's also making your lungs or your diaphragm to contract faster, so that you have so essentially it's like you can't catch your breath kind of thing. And then the cerebellum is essentially is the second largest part of the brain. So the cerebellum is this portion right here, and you can always identify it because it looks like the tree of life, or it looks like a tree. So essentially, the cerebellum is going to fine tune motor movements. So what I mean by fine tune motor movements, so your motor movements, like I can move my hand nice and smoothly versus shaking. This would not be fine motor movements. This is fine motor movements where you're nice and smooth. Shaking would not be a fine motor movement. So my cerebellum is allowing me to essentially move my hand nice and smoothly. What's really, really cool with the cerebellum is essentially the cerebellum is the last stage before a motor movement. So the frontal cortex of your brain essentially is telling, if I'm wanting to move my hand, my frontal cortex is telling my cerebellum that I want to move my hand. So essentially, the frontal cortex sends like a rough draft of what it wants it to do to the cerebellum. So essentially, my frontal lobe is doing this, is telling my hand to move like this. But my cerebellum takes that rough draft and turn and makes it more smooth, essentially. It essentially fine tunes it. That's what I mean by fine motor movements. So my frontal cortex is telling me to move my hand, but my cerebellum is essentially correcting it to make it very smooth at that point. So that's one reason why if people are having Parkinson's, it may attack the cerebellum so you don't have fine motor movements, but it's not attacking the frontal lobe, so you're still able to move. That's why you're really kind of shaky, is because you essentially have damaged one part of the brain, but the other parts of the brain can actually has influence on it too. So this portion right here has a lot to do with motor movements. So when it comes to drinking alcohol or essentially being inebriated, that cerebellum controls all fine motor movements. So any movement that you do, your cerebellum essentially makes it nice and smooth. However, under the influence of alcohol causes those neurons to misfire and to fire a lot slower in the cerebellum. So the cerebellum isn't really good at making those movements nice and smooth at that point. They're very kind of all over the place. So that's one reason why they do a field sobriety test, is why they make you walk in a straight line, is because if you're under the influence of alcohol, your cerebellum is no longer able to really make you move smoothly or walk straight, essentially. Your skeletal muscles are going to be very, very shaky. They're only getting the rough draft from your frontal cortex. So your frontal cortex can tell your legs to move, but your cerebellum is so affected that it can't make the move nice and smoothly and in order. So essentially, that's why you kind of stagger when you're walking under the influence of alcohol. Also, you're unable to essentially maintain balance. Your balance is controlled by the inner portion of your ear. You have what's called a cochlea on the inside of your ear, and that's ran by nerves. If you're moving those nerves a lot more slowly, they're not able to get those impulses as fast. So essentially, you lose your balance a lot easier. Also, you lose the ability of proprioceptive information, which means your brain doesn't can't tell whether or not are you standing up, are you sitting down, are you laying down. It loses that reception or that information. So that's one reason why you stagger and you stumble, because your brain can't really understand if you're standing or sitting or not. So that's why you can essentially fall over a lot, or you kind of stagger, you kind of fall, or stumble, it's because of that region there. Also, you can also do a test of making a person close their eyes and touch their nose. The thing is with the cerebellum, if you're under the influence of alcohol, you lose like hand-eye coordination. So when they tell you to close your eyes and try to touch your nose, usually if you're under the influence of alcohol, you're going to miss your nose. You're going to touch like your mouth or your face because it can't figure out where your hand is. That's what proprioceptive information is. If I close my eyes, I know my hand is on the side of my head. I know it's in the front of my face. But when I'm inebriated, my cerebellum doesn't know anymore. And so essentially when you try to close your eyes and touch your nose and they tell you to touch your nose, you can't figure out where your nose is. Your brain doesn't know where your nose is at that point. Also, cognitively, which they don't mention, that you can essentially make someone count or do their ABCs backwards. Now, I'm going to be honest, even me being sober, I cannot do my ABCs backwards. I got XYZ or ZYX. That's the furthest I probably can go. So I'd probably just essentially ask for a breathalyzer at that point because I couldn't even say it if I was not inebriated. Never have been inebriated, but same difference. I would not be able to say my ABCs backwards. I can barely say it forwards almost. But point being is the cerebellum has a really big part to play or role to play when it comes to spine motor movements or proprioception. So the limbic system, which the limbic system is essentially an area of the brain that essentially it's made of several structures that processes and experiences emotions. Um, in this region, you have what's called the amygdaloid body. So how I can always remember that the amygdaloid body controls emotions. I remember, I think in the first or second grade, I had a friend named Amy, and her grandmother had passed away. And I remember she cried for like 2 days straight. Of course, I understand that, if I ever lost my grandparents. But how I've always remembered is that Amy was sad. So amygdaloid, which is the first part, is Amy. That's how I've always remembered it. Amygdaloid is going to essentially refer to your emotions. So there's different parts of your brain that controls emotions. So I mean, we always hear the medulla oblongata, but not really. But there's different portions of your brain. So the temporal portions, the frontal portions, parietal lobes, they all have an influence on emotions. So they can also store memories that are based on emotions. Also, that can be fear, that can be happiness and sadness. So all emotions can essentially run through the amygdaloid or the hippocampus. Um, so they both so all structures of the brain all kind of function together for certain functions. So here in this picture here, we're seeing how we're getting sensory information from the eyes. We're also getting sensory information from essentially touch, pain, and temperature receptors from the body. So we can see these blue arrows coming from the eyes, which is sensory information. We can see it coming up the spinal cord from the rest of the body, and then we can also get sensory information coming from our ears. Um, and then we can have what's called motor output. So essentially, if we see a lion running towards us and we can hear the lion running towards us, um, essentially we can react to it. So we use all of our senses to cause a motor function to happen. So this is essentially what this picture is really kind of showing is how we can use different information, whether that be from eyes, ears, or a combination, to essentially it sends it to the brain. The brain is the cerebrum is going to essentially interpret this information, generate a process or output, and it's going to send it through motor axons down the spinal cord, more certainly, definitely to the pons and the medulla. The pons is going to, or the pons and medulla is going to cause heart rate to increase. It's going to cause your breathing to increase. It's going to send a signal down to your muscles to start contracting faster, so that your heart can beat faster, so that you can get more oxygen and so forth. So all our senses are really more or less survival mechanism, but we can take all these senses and sensory organs, and our brain is using all of them to essentially come up with a solution to get us out of situation or to problem solve. So it's really cool of how our brain takes all this information and wraps it up. Now, there are some different levels of unconsciousness. So in this picture up here, it's showing us different waves. So there's beta waves, alpha waves, theta waves, and delta waves. So alpha and beta waves. So beta waves are going to essentially is going to show us waves or brain waves of when we are awake, and when we're having mental activity. So when we're cognitive thinking about things, alpha waves are going to show us waves when we are awake but resting. Theta waves are going to be shown us when we are like in a non-rapid eye movement sleeping. So when we were kind of like in a light sleeping pattern, like when we first go to sleep, and then we have deep sleep waves, which is also called delta waves. Is when it's going to show us our brain activity when we are essentially in that deep or that REM stage of sleeping. So there's some different things that can come with consciousness of the mind or the brain activity rather. So depends on if you had a traumatic brain injury, a stroke, if you're having low blood sugar, which you can pass out if you have low blood sugar or even high blood sugar, you can go to a coma, or you can have liver or kidney diseases. So if you have a brief episode where you kind of pass out, we call that fainting or syncope, which is the actual medical term for it. And this could be due to low blood pressure. So again, if you put someone in a chokehold and decrease their pressure of their carotid arteries, you can cause someone to pass out. If you are overstressed, you can essentially cause someone to faint. Stupor, however, stupor is actually a deep level of unconsciousness, which essentially the person has to really kind of like being slapped out of it. So like you've seen on movies where people faint, but then they have to kind of like slap them to wake back up. So that would be stupor. A coma is a deep state of unconsciousness where the person can't be aroused. So in a coma, if a person is in a coma, you can shake them to death, but they don't wake up, or it doesn't stimulate them to wake up. Some people can be in coma for years or for days, kind of thing. Depends on the kind of trauma that there is. A person that's in a coma has no idea what's going on around them. They don't know how much time has passed. So even when we're sleeping, we understand that we're laying down. We understand that we're in our bedrooms or in a bed. I mean, if you can think about it, there's times where, if our alarm clock doesn't go off, we kind of wake up trying to figure out there's been a lot of time that has passed that we shouldn't be getting as much sleep. So I'm like, we're aware when we're sleeping. Our brain is still active when we're sleeping. In a coma, there is usually no really activity or very much activity at all. You can have what's called a persistent vegetative state. Essentially, this is where we get the term vegetable from, which is not a very nice term. But vegetative state essentially is where the person can be either unconscious or awake, but has no self-awareness or of one's around surroundings. So people who are in this type of state, they might have spontaneous movements. Um, they could have their face could make facial expressions maybe, but it's not necessarily saying that there is brain activity. It can just be responses happening that are from neurons happening causing twitches, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's brain activity. So typically if someone's in this kind of state, sometimes they get taken off life support. So there are some different brain activity disorders that can potentially happen. So with REM sleep, essentially you have two types of sleeping. You have REM and then you have non-REM. So REM stands for rapid eye movement. So when someone's actually in a deep sleep, and if you ever get a chance to look at someone when they're sleeping, you can actually see their eyelids kind of twitching a lot because their eyes are actually rapidly moving. So that's how you know they're in a deep sleep. So with REM, they're actually essentially this is where dreams actually start happening. So if you're ever dreaming, you're in a deep sleep. And this only actually happens for 25% of the time that we're actually sleeping. Non-REM actually happens more than anything. And scientists actually believe that with non-REM sleeping, you're actually organizing memories. You're actually consolidating memories. You're actively cleaning up your brain, those plaques, the mess that your brain has made that day. It's actively cleaning that. Your immune system is kind of washing away a lot of the different things that are in your brain. Also, this is when your short-term memory gets wiped out like a processor. It kind of just wipes out the short-term memory. So interesting enough that infants usually need about 17 to 18 hours of sleep a day. But this drops as we get older, of course. Typically teenagers, which I know most of my students are, they need about 8.5 to 9.5 hours of sleep a night on average. So do understand this is textbook numbers. I know everyone's bodies is different. But as you become an adult, about 7 to 8 hours of sleep is usually about average. Typically, I can operate on a good 4 to 6 hours. If I sleep more than that, I kind of feel really, really groggy. This because you have to find a good balance. If you sleep too much, you kind of feel really kind of tired and groggy. If you don't sleep enough, you feel really tired and groggy. So you got to find that nice medium between there. Insomnia is essentially when you can't sleep. Um, that can be due to a lot of different factors, but one that's common that most people probably don't realize that is sleep apnea, which is this word right here. So sometimes with sleep apnea, you kind of stop breathing while you're sleeping. So essentially, you end up having to wear this CPAP, which is continuous positive airway pressure machine, which essentially they look a little bit different now. They used to be like this big mask that went over your face, and it just essentially rushed air into your nose and your mouth, and it kept your airway open while you slept. Most people actually sleep very well. Their quality of sleeping changes tremendously with using an AirPad or a CPAP. My mother suffers from sleep apnea, and her sleep regimen changed big time after that because essentially you stop breathing in your sleep, and it really affects how you feel the next morning when you wake up tremendously. You need to be able to breathe while you're sleeping. So I invite you to go get a sleep study and see if you're actually breathing while you're sleeping, if you stop breathing while you're sleeping, because having sleep apnea can really affect your sleep cycles. So short-term memory and long-term memory. So essentially, short-term memory is a limited capacity or a brief duration. So the book gives the example if, let's say, suppose that in a Friday morning anatomy and physiology lecture, your instructor lists a general functions of cerebral lobes on the board. Unless you study this information over the weekend, you will probably not be able to recall it by Monday's lecture. Now, again, the book said it, not me, but it's true. If I say something in lecture, usually my students are not going to remember by the time they come back to lecture the next day unless they study it. In long-term memory, if you actually study that material over and over and over again, what I said in lecture, you'll actually store it in your long-term memory. Remember, when you go to sleep, your mind kind of wipes out your short-term memory. But if you put in your long-term memory, it's going to last a long time. Here go its name, but it'll last for limitless periods of time. So essentially, you can kind of almost remember it forever, almost kind of like a core memory. So when it comes to learning something, you have to be able to repeat it over and over again. So for the example for long-term memory, so essentially by rewriting your notes, memorizing or quizzing yourself, working with a study partner, explaining a lecture concept to someone else. By you taking notes, by you talking to other people or telling other people about what you've learned, you're teaching other people. By you teaching, you're actually learning it too. By you writing it down, it's committing it to memory because now your mind remembers, oh, I wrote this down somewhere. Also, if you chew gum while you're taking notes, sometimes smells will trigger your memory. Also, if you listen to music while you are studying, that helps you remember because you can remember during that song, you remember reading about this particular thing. So everything in our brains are connected to each other. They all work together. That's one reason why music can be therapy for people. Like if you have a stroke or they have brain surgery, like they can use music. Music can be healing. If you have amnesia, which means you have short-term memory loss or long-term memory loss, they've been able to use music because we know that with music, there's some songs that would take you back to when you were younger. There's some smells that can take you back to your younger. Be it smell, sense, touch, feel, they're all linked to each other. So sometimes when people have memory loss, we can usually trigger some of their memories by, showing them a picture or showing or giving them smells. It can trigger some of these memories to come back, especially if they're in your long-term potential memory. Speaking of memories, we have the other side of that if you start losing memory. So we have what's called Alzheimer's or dementia. So dementia is just a generalization of memory loss. So it's also memory loss, it's cognitive abilities, language, decision-making skills. So it's a very generalized statement. But Alzheimer's can actually be a cause leading to dementia. So again, Alzheimer's is essentially where you have those plaques in your brain building up. It causes dopamines not to be, well, that's kind of Parkinson's too, but it stops connection between your neurons of your brain. So Alzheimer's gradually decreases language. It impairs your visual spatial skills. It changes your attitude. So people who have AD can actually have like these random bursts of anger. Um, their personality changes. I'm like, you got to think about it. Your personality is controlled by your brain. So I'm like, if you have different portions of your brain that is essentially dying off, you don't really have good judgment, and I mean, you may fly off the handle pretty quickly. Um, also, but interesting enough, it leaves your motor function intact. So sometimes people who have things like Parkinson's and things of that nature, they have issues like if they are able to get to the toilet, it's like they have a hard time getting off the toilet, kind of thing. However, it's called the long goodbye because it's a very slow process. Sometimes it progresses relentlessly over months and years. Um, Eventually, they become restless. They're usually sometimes asking the exact same question over and over again. Sometimes they start kind of having hallucinations every now and then. They lose their memory. They also lose their former personality, and then they eventually lose their capacity to speak because that portion of the brain, those neurons essentially died. So essentially, you start seeing those cells start dying off in the brain. If you don't have, remember, structure determines function. So if you lose that structure, you lose that function. So, Alzheimer's is a very kind of heartbreaking disease, also with dementia, especially if you don't, like if your parents or your spouse or they're unable to recognize you at a certain point, and it's very very heartbreaking when certain individuals can't recognize each other because of a disease. So here we can actually see the brain of a normal brain, and then we see the enlarged ventricles. We also see that the brain essentially starts to shrink. So essentially, those brain cells start to die off. And so now we see that we have this big space in the brain because there's no cells taking up that space anymore. And also those ventricles that we see here, they're supposed to be a certain size. They've now gotten bigger because they have a lot more space now. And so You do literally in the Alzheimer's brain, I think this is an MRI, we can see that the brain starts to shrink at that point. And the brain starts to shrink, you start to lose a lot of function of the body. And then amnesia is just either as a temporary or long-term memory loss. Um, Again, we can kind of treat it with different types of therapies, but depends on which part of the brain was hit, depends on what part of the brain had trauma. It just depends. It honestly just depends on and how extensive was the damage. So there's a lot of different factors that can go in. Stroke can come into that. So I mean, there's a lot of different factors, but amnesia is just a generalization of memory loss. Dyslexia. So essentially, people who have dyslexia, essentially their mind switches around how letters look. People who have dyslexia, when they have to be diagnosed. Some people say that they have dyslexia, but they really don't. Dyslexia, your brain is going to flip letters around. So like a D would be like a B. And so when your brain does that, you have a hard time reading because it flips letters around. And so you're trying to pronounce these words, but you don't know that your brain has flipped them around. So that's one reason I say you have to be diagnosed with it. Um, you can overcome dyslexia. There's tools that we have now that people can go through. There's therapies that people have to go through. I actually had a student who not only had dyslexia, but she had double vision. So when she'd see, like when she was younger, when she was in kindergarten, they told her to paint a tree, and she painted two because she would see double of things. Not only that, her brain would take words, flip them backwards and upside down. So it was very difficult for her to read. Um, she actually graduated 4.0 last year. So, you can always overcome if you put the work in, you can always overcome it. But hers was a very rare type of dyslexia where it just flipped the words upside down and backwards, and then she saw them double. So she had a really difficult time reading. But dyslexia, I forget how many it affects. It's common, but not very, very common. It's probably one in every 1,000 or 10,000 people actually have dyslexia. So on the bottom side of your brain, you have what's called cranial nerves, and you have 12 of them, I believe. So every cranial nerve controls something. So we have the olfactory, which is going to be responsible for your nose or smelling. Your optic chiasm is essentially where your optic nerves are going to meet. Then you have the infundibulum, which isn't an optic nerve, but it's where your pituitary gland is. You have your oculomotor nerve. So oculo, we know oculo means eye, motor means movement. So this is the nerve that's going to move your eye. You have your trochlear. You have your trigeminal, which your trigeminal has three. That's why it's called trigeminal, because it has three nerves that are going to innervate some things. You have your facial nerve, which is your facial nerve runs right along your mandible and in your maxilla. So that's actually the nerve that they're going to try to tap into when you get numbed at the doctor's office or the dentist's office. That's the facial nerve that they really want to attack. Also, if you have cold sores or herpes simplex 1, this is that facial nerve is where that virus is actually going to essentially lay dormant until you become stressed or it gets cold. Is those will actually pop out at that time. You have the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve is really important because it's going to control it's going to control your diaphragm, your intercostals, external intercostals, and things of that nature. So this chart gives a really good breakdown of what all of these do. So it gives you the sensory and it gives you the motor function of it. So we have olfactory for smell, optics for vision, oculomotor is for the eye muscles to move the eye. Trochlear is for the eye muscles as well. mastication, so it's going to cause you to be able to chew. Um, the the abductions, which is going to be the sixth cranial nerve number 6, is going to help for the eye movement. Cranial nerve number 7, which I know these are Roman numerals, but these Roman numerals are numbers. So this is 7. That's going to cause for hearing. 6 is for facial expressions. 7 is for hearing. 8 is for 8's for hearing. 9 is for general sensory. So this is going to be around your tongue. So this essentially is going to be the sensory of your tongue. And then your vagus is going to be for your heart, your tympanic membrane, so for your ear, also for your breathing, your essentially you being able to talk. Cranial nerve number 11 is going to be for a trapezius muscle in your sternocleidomastoid, which is this muscle right here that you can feel. And then your 12th one is your hypoglossal, which is going to be essentially for your tongue muscles. So you have 12 main nerves that come right off the brain that are going to innervate these different muscles or these different regions of the brain. So here, your olfactory bulb, these are axons that are going to extend down into your nose. So those are going to essentially pick up the chemicals when you are breathing or smelling something, especially like coffee. Those chemicals that or that aroma that's being given off gets sucked into your nose and is going to attach to these axons. Those axons are going to send action potentials to the olfactory bulb. That olfactory bulb is then going to send a message or action potential to the brain. The brain is going to interpret it, and then that what's going to tell essentially the rest of the brain, oh, this is coffee, or that this chemical is safe. The reason why we have smell is because we need to make sure that this is something that our bodies can actually have, or that this is something safe for our body. That's the point of having smell and taste. And when we get into senses, we'll notice that if you clamp off your nose, it kind of dampens your ability to be able to taste certain things. So, and the rest of this chart just gives more detail about what the cranial nerves do. Yes, you need to know your cranial nerves. Now, to remember all the cranial nerves, here's a simple mnemonic. So, oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly, which we're coming up to spring break. So, but here's a mnemonic that you can remember all the cranial nerves. So it's olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibule, cochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. And these are actually in order. So yes, you will need to know this, and this is a way that you can kind of remember all your cranial nerves. Now, I know this was a lot. This was a big chapter, but the thing is, the brain has a lot of different functions. Different portions of the brain control different things. There's different disorders that can cause different issues to happen. So it's very important that we understand the nervous system and how the central nervous system actually works, how our brain works, how it controls the rest of our body. So I hope you learned something new. I know this was long, but hopefully you learned something new and that this was educational. All right, until next time, I will see you then.